I'm Craig with Velocity Growth. Really appreciate you all taking a big chunk of your day to spend some time with us. We hope you find this valuable. I'm going to dive right in here. So we ran a poll, and it looks like a good number of you have actually leveraged cold email in the past, which is good. Hopefully, you can learn something new here, and we'd love to hear your context and feedback about what's worked and what hasn't worked for you over the years as you've dabbled in and kind of have explored working with cold email. So what I'm going to talk about today is building effective cold email campaigns. And I will start by saying this has been, there's been some pain for me building cold email over the years. Sometimes it's worked extraordinarily well. Other times applying the same principles to a similar industry haven't worked at all. And in hindsight, I think we understand why some things worked and some things didn't work. But the first caveat is I would set the expectation that cold email is effectively one giant set of experimentations, right? So basically, you have to approach cold email in the pre-scale stage as a channel that you can use that you're likely going to have to run dozens, if not hundreds, of micro experiments within. It's quite simply impossible to go from zero to scale over cold email unless you know a number of things about your buyer, your offer and packaging is perfective, your messaging is perfective. But I'd love to start with a definition. So this is how I think about cold email, at least to quantify it a little bit compared to other channels. So cold email is a very direct customer acquisition channel, meaning you're getting in front of a human directly. It's not passive. It's very forward looking. It's typically a way to supplement your marketing efforts, or it's actually a net new channel. There's entire teams that you can build around cold outreach. And it's not uncommon, especially for B2B companies, to have a whole team of SDRs, sales development reps, in roles where they're doing cold outreach at some level of scale. Now, almost every single one of those companies that I see at scale went through some of the perils and pitfalls of trying to scale cold email too early. And I'm going to walk you through a process that I've seen now work about a dozen times with a whole bunch of different customers in industry types to hopefully save you a bunch of time. Cold email is also a really, really great channel for you if you have different types of audiences with different types of intent. And what I mean by that is some of you have clients that are looking for a solution to a problem that they have, and they go out and they seek you out. And the channels that work great for that are SEO and search engine marketing. And some of you have a customer base that they're not even aware that they've got a problem, right? And so in those cases, you're kind of injecting your brand in front of the persona. So when you talk to a marketing team or you talk to a marketer and the marketer starts asking you questions about your business, often what they're trying to do is hone in on some level of customer intent that they can glean and apply to a set of channels that they think is going to work for you to scale your marketing efforts. What's great about cold email is it actually works across that whole spectrum. So if you've got a low intent or a high intent audience, we've seen cold email be really, really effective because you're getting this very direct messaging in front of a human. And so to ask yourself, is cold email right for me, right? So again, it's all sorts of B2B companies primarily could benefit from cold outreach. If you've got a very low cost B2B offering, you may not be able to, in a cost-effective manner, leverage cold outreach as a channel. So there are some cost constraints that you have to consider when thinking about B2B, just like you'd have to do with any other channel. But what I do love about cold email is that it doesn't actually cost you a lot of money to run the basics. And what we'll cover today is a lot of the basics, and we'll get into some of the weeds with how to scale it. But the other thing, the trade-off with cold email is it's actually very, very expensive time-wise. And as a startup, we're always balancing cost or spend or money against time. And so those of you that are kind of post product market fit and are now leveraging kind of real growth loops to grow your businesses, you're in a very, very different stage than the pre-product market fit companies who maybe don't have a budget, but have time, right? So you really have to think about it from a lens of, do I have time to spend on cold outreach? Am I willing to invest my time here to learn how to do it well? It's very hard to delegate this channel. The earlier you are, the harder it is. And so we had some massive failings as Velocity Growth by me thinking that we could just outsource cold outreach before we really knew who our persona was. And I can tell you it just wasn't effective. And I'll share some of those wins and losses as we go. Before you're really ready to run great cold outreach campaigns, there's a few things that you need. And they're these. First of all, you have to have a sense of who your target is. So if you don't know who fairly specifically your target is, your ideal customer profile, or one or more targets or personas, and I'll use those terms interchangeably. If you don't really know who that is yet, then this channel is going to be very hard for you. You're going to fail for a very long time, likely, and possibly get frustrated and just want to give up on the channel. But it's not really the channel's fault, because what you have to do is you have to get the right message in front of the person that resonates with that message and with your offer. And you can validate the benefit that your product brings to them. So you have to have a sense of what that is. You also have to have a way to target people. So in this cold email channel, you have to do list building. And so this doesn't mean that you go and buy a list from somebody, but what it means is that you have to look at your ideal customer profile very narrowly and find a way to pull email addresses and potentially other information about these targets, your persona that you're going after. Hard stop. You have to do it. You can't just spin up email campaigns without that. And there's a bunch of work there. The third thing is you have to have great content. I mean, we all get the emails from people that we hate, right? We get cold emails that are just pure spam. They're not targeted at all. And they really, at least for me, they really irritate me. And often if I get a persistent, irrelevant set of cold email sequences, I may actually mark it as spam, especially if I've unsubscribed. I get tons of cold email. And if I unsubscribe and it's not easy to unsubscribe, and I keep hearing from that person, that is spam, right? That is kind of the definition of spam. You're getting unsolicited email that doesn't give you a way to opt out. Conversely, I have actually engaged fairly frequently with great cold email content. If there's a solution to a problem that I have, the company Ramp is coming to mind right now. I'm in conversations with them, and there's Breck's corporate card, which I've received outreach from both of those startups. And the offer is timely and compelling. Same with Carta, actually. I'll use them as well. All three of them have products that we could potentially use at our stage of our business. We're kind of in the just pre-Series A stage. So their content was good enough to get me to engage and reply. But a lot of what we see is just bad. The fourth thing you need is tools and systems, and I'll walk you through what we're using. And then the fifth is just a whole bunch of experimentation. So when I talked about our early lessons, the hard lessons in cold outreach, these are some real stats on our early cold outreach campaigns. I'm going to pause on this slide for a little while. So I mentioned that cold email is great when you know your buyer, but what I thought we could do about a year and a half ago was pull the future forward. We're a fairly aggressive team. We want to grow our startup as fast as possible. So we invested in cold outreach. And The open rates here are strong and the click-through rates are strong. And the reply rates are actually pretty good. But the problem is that it took August, September, October, and actually we're working on this in July that year. And in fact, in June, 5 months of feeling like we're on the cusp of understanding how to crack this channel. And we just never got any better. And the reason was because we didn't fully understand who our target buyer was. And even worse, we didn't understand what value we brought to the table to that target. So we're getting clicks and we're getting some replies, right? And the platform, the cold email channel itself is working, but it was all vanity replies. We didn't get any business from these efforts at all. I had a bunch of meetings booked. I had a bunch of replies that I thought maybe this person is interested, but turns out what the value we were bringing to the table didn't match what they actually needed. And so I found myself on dozens and dozens of calls that at the end of the day, the lead just isn't interested in what we're offering. And at that time it was only exclusively doing training. So you really have to take your time and don't go for scale. So, okay, well, it begs the question. Okay, so if we failed at it because we didn't fully know our ideal customer profile and we didn't truly understand the benefits that we as a company could provide to that very cold audience, well, what do you do? I would recommend that because cold outreach is so time intensive, if you don't know your ICP, then test targeting on other channels to find the messaging and the persona that works for you, right? And so we have this like flow chart that we use internally. And what we generally recommend, if you don't have a really strong sense of who your buyer and even what the messaging and what your packaging, which is your pricing and your constraints, if you don't have a great sense of what that is yet, and the earlier you are, probably the harder it is to get a sense of what that is, then you're going to need to do this learning somewhere else. And what I would recommend is that you think about it this way. So you have this message persona view, or just this persona mapping, where you as a startup determine your value prop and your benefits. So what are the characteristics of your brand or product that add value to your target's life, right? How does it make them happier, healthier, save time, save money, look better, feel better, right? Those are your kind of motivators. And then you map those benefit statements to the persona. And then you start to think about your offer. So in the paid channel side of things, you can learn really, really, really quickly if your message and creative that encompass that offer, if that's resonating with your target audience. So if you try to do this in cold email, you have to build the sequences, you have to pull the list, you have to find the emails, you have to have a system to send emails. And then you have to launch it and you have to get that feedback. And it's very, very incremental and very slow. So what we generally recommend is go to paid channels, understand if your offer is resonating to your persona, understand if your pricing and your constraints match. So I put those in the packaging bucket. Does that give you the ability to actually drive conversions? And if so, basically you've got a persona fit based on a message and an offer and a package that you're putting in front of them. So if you can go through this whole flow chart and get to the end and it's like, okay, well, I can start with a persona. They understand the value that I bring to the table. They resonate with this type of message. They like this type of creative. And when I expose them to pricing and constraints, so like if you're a SaaS company, I'm using Miro for this flow chart. So Miro's constraint is number of seats that you can get with an account or number of boards that you can create. And this is a board, number of boards that you can create for the free plan versus a paid tier plan. That's what they use for constraint. So if you can move through this whole flow chart and get to the end and like there, you've got some conviction that you can find conversions based on this, then great. That's your starting persona. And if you can do that, that'll work really, really well for cold outreach. Now, it doesn't mean that cold outreach is going to be easy, but it means that you understand the persona that you're going after. And when you think about building your list, right? I Googled persona, and this was the first thing that came up. We've all probably seen this, right? There's nothing wrong with this type of persona. I think it is useful to understand jobs to be done, goals, frustrations, and all that stuff. But what I would hone right in on for my list building are the very specific granular details about the persona that we can map our messaging and value back to. The rest of this stuff is just kind of really fluffy and isn't really that usable for cold outreach. So when you're doing cold outreach, when you think about a target or a persona, it doesn't have to be this like fully thought out process, right? What it needs to be is something that you can put through this sequence and you get to the other side and it's like this value prop, message, pricing, constraint is viable. And again, I would use paid channels, and Jen will get into this afternoon, use paid channels to help you determine how to make sense of all the chaos that's happening within your business. So, you don't need all this stuff, but here's what you actually do need. Okay. So what you actually need is target company's industry. Now, that's not required necessarily, but it's really great if you do know that industry. Target company size, persona, job title or role, an understanding of your offer, and then ideally a single specific ask. And that's, what is the goal of your email? What are you actually trying to get them to do? Are you trying to get them to click something, to reply back to you? Are you trying to get them to sign up for something? Are you trying to get them into a free trial? Are you doing customer discovery? Do you want them to answer a couple of questions? Those are what I mean by having a specific ask. Any questions so far?
I have a question. This is Dominique, Craig.
Sure thing.
So my question would be more so for the target. Just for example, I have 1,800 people that when you go to my website, you have to enter your email address to get me. So would that be considered my group because they are already my customers or potential customers? And then is that what you're speaking of when you say to gather people or gather those addresses?
It's a great question. So that would be what I would consider your general marketing email list or your general list. And you absolutely should have a strategy for engaging with them. It's probably slightly different than net new. So if you want to take that 1,800 and grow that to 3,000 by using cold outreach, what you're probably going to look for is some pattern matching with those 1,800 people that became customers. What are those characteristics? What industry are they? Can you find a signal within an industry or a company size or a persona, like the job title itself? Is there enough density of persona that you can now go and actually create a new list that is not something that you yet own, but something that you're going to use some of the tools I'll walk you through in a little bit on,
Okay.
and actually go after cold users who have never heard of your brand
Okay.
before in most
Okay.
cases. Does that make sense?
Yes, it does.
But all of this stuff is related, right? So if you think about, I love the question because we think about cold outreach, at least I traditionally would think about cold outreach as a start and end. So you start with somebody has never heard of you and you end with like a reply or a conversation. But really, when you think about the entire life cycle of your marketing program, remember, we're talking about cold email, and Jen's going to talk about paid acquisition, and Darren's going to talk about SEO, and Jen's going to talk about organic. Those are 4 different big buckets that fit within your overall marketing strategy and your overall startup growth strategy. So where cold email stops is kind of where your marketing activation is going to kind of pick up. So for our own cold outreach, we get a lot of newsletter signups from cold outreach, because what happens is they'll reply to my campaigns, and I'll show you some of this when we get deeper. But somebody that's never heard about our brand will reply. They'll be like, hey, sounds kind of cool. I don't need it right now, but I'll keep you in mind. And then I'll reply back, hey, is it okay if I sign you up for our marketing newsletter where we share growth tactics and all these other things? And they're like, yeah, that'd be great. So then I just I usually will forward it to somebody on my team who will go and they'll literally sign them up in our HubSpot account. So now you have crossover from cold to warm. And now that person that we quote unquote acquired from cold outreach, who's just on a cold list, they don't live in HubSpot and all the other platforms that we have yet. Now they get added to that. And now they get to see the additional value because they've opted in that we can provide as a brand. And that shows a certain level of intent. It's not yet buyer intent, right? But again, cold outreach is generally not a direct channel where you're going to get that revenue conversion right away. So I would think about it in terms of these stages where cold is one of the many steps that user or audience is going to take before they become a user or brand ambassador of your platform. So when we think about company industry, again, this is not required, but these are great to have. So on the left is a industry search from a platform called Apollo that I'll share a bunch about Apollo in a little bit. It's one of the platforms that you can use to find email addresses and pull email addresses and actually send email from. Does anybody recognize this one on the right? Anybody? What platform is this? It's LinkedIn Sales Navigator. So in LinkedIn Sales Navigator, you have this very, very granular view of list building. Now, in LinkedIn Sales Navigator, they don't give you the email addresses of your targets, but what LinkedIn tries to do is sell you their in-mail package. And I think you can send 200 or 500 emails via in-mail from the LinkedIn platform. But using different tools, you could build a list in, for example, Sales Navigator, and then use another tool to pull down email addresses and then put them into your cold outreach campaigns. Okay. So I guess the other takeaway here is that if you don't really know your industry that you're targeting, it's going to take you a lot longer to get to any level of scale with cold email. And I think we also learned this the hard way with Velocity Growth, where we hadn't done any industry targeting at the start. And it turns out there are certain industries that work best for our training and our consultancy and everything else that we do. And had we known that going in, we would have been a lot more diligent about building these company industries now. So when I build cold outreach campaigns now, I'm generally starting with an industry in mind. Could be technology, information services. If I want to run a partnership strategy with web development shops, I maybe I'll click on the software development. If I'm going after the travel space and either executives or somebody within the travel space industry, I'm going to go airlines, aviation. And then what I can do is I can hone my messaging. So remember, my messaging has to resonate with a persona. If I'm targeting based on industry, though, I have another level of granularity that I can add in. So instead of saying hey, Adrian, I'm Craig, and I'm with Velocity Growth, and we provide a lot of tools and frameworks, much of it free, on how to grow your startup. Great. Well, I could say, and I'm picking on Adrian. I don't know, Adrian, I actually don't know what your business is, but let's say you were an airline. Hey, Adrian, I saw you're the founder of, Sonos Airlines, and customer acquisition in the airline industry is really hard. Well, here are 5 things that you can do to think about. So you could just target much more granularly. And I would think about that from an industry standpoint. Next is company size. And again, we failed a lot here. It's orders of magnitude different to target people that work at a company that's 1 to 10 versus 500 to 1,000. I mean, it's just an entirely different process. Your cold outreach campaign for 51 to 200 is going to be completely different than your cold outreach campaign to companies size 501 to 1,000, because the persona that you're going after, their job, their wants and needs and jobs to be done are completely different than those at a much smaller company. At the 1 to 10, at the self-employed or 1 to 10 stage, you're probably talking to a founder. At the 500 to 1,000, you're probably talking to a director or a head of something, or maybe a VP. If you're trying to target an executive of 1,000+ company, direct cold outreach probably isn't going to work for you, right? So there are some limitations where it would work. So just be really, really, really mindful. Again, I would ask yourself, what have I learned about my target persona from other channels and other conversations I've had? And what are the other learnings that I have about the company size of who we work for? So with Velocity Growth, I mean, the team that's on the call right now, they'll know that we think about startups. There's a 4x4 grid that we use. It's their consumer or enterprise, that's sliding scale from consumer to enterprise, and their pre-product market fit are very early stage to very late stage. And we have sweet spots within that we work with. And in the company headcount of between 20 and 250 is usually where we're at this stage of our growth, is where we're most effective, right? Because we might be a little bit too expensive for the self-employed person or the 1 to 10, where they're just problem finding still. And we don't have like all of the offerings in like a beautifully designed package. Like we're pretty scrappy, like in a beautifully designed package for the 1,000 or 2,000 person company, right? So we've had to hone in and find that sweet spot. You're going to need to do the same. Any questions here? And again, I'm going to show you this and we're going to go through a whole, like we're going to set one of these campaigns up from scratch. If no questions, I'm going to keep moving. Okay, job title, role. Probably not something that we often would think about, because we're not doing this type of thing on other channels when we're marketing. Like when you're marketing on Facebook, you're not like, oh, I'm going after the marketing manager necessarily, or on Google or on a lot of other channels. But for cold outreach, just like if you're doing targeted advertising on LinkedIn, for example, you absolutely are going to look at this job title. And this is really essential. So, and again, you'll probably have a lot of lessons to learn here, but on the right is LinkedIn Sales Navigator. So for whatever this test I was running on the right, I was going after people with a job title that included marketing. So this must have been for training. So our messaging and targeting, again, company size 20 to 50, marketing specialist, marketing analyst. So I know the things that our brand could bring a value to them, and those are going to be very different value points than companies of 2,000 going after a VP of marketing. The VP of marketing's needs are way different than the marketing specialist needs, right? So you really have to think about that combination of industry, company size, and now role, right? So industry, size, role. Then you can start to think about, okay, well, what do you know about your offer and packaging that you could put in front of this audience? So now we're going to go one level deeper. So when we're thinking about cold outreach, we're thinking about, well, what's the value in what we're offering? Because again, we all get these cold emails that we sometimes mark as spam, and it's certainly just collect dust in our inbox or get completely ignored. Or occasionally they really irritate us and we write back something to the person that maybe isn't nice, right? It's why do you do that? Well, it's because they're not showing us any value in what they're offering. And so think back on that messaging and look at, okay, well, what has worked in other channels? And what can I learn from those other channels in terms of that messaging and positioning? What is it that I uniquely solve in the market, and what can I bring to the table? And again, I've underlined this, but if you directly try to sell, just doesn't happen. I've never seen a cold email that gets me to go from, I don't know anything about this brand to like, yeah, I'm going to buy your thing. Never once. It's never worked that way. Maybe for some of your industries, that more direct, blunt approach could work. Certainly, that approach for cold outreach can work if you're trying to do things like partnership development and other things. You can be a lot more direct. But if you're trying to sell something, it's not the way to go. So I'm going to show you an example here. This is very, very recent, actually. You can see this was just a few days ago. I try to use like some of the most up-to-date examples because things are constantly changing. And I've hidden the names, companies, and email. So yeah, basically what I'm trying to do here with this cold email is my ask is I want to get a reply, right? So this particular campaign, what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to just get a pulse check on this audience. So you could see at the top here in email one, hi Len, what do cold email, paid acquisition, SEO, and content strategy have in common? When used correctly, they do something. They enable startups to grow. Okay. What I didn't expect with this, but was actually the goal, was this was actually for a product, but this person writes back, does Velocity offer these services? I was like, okay, well, there's already a disconnect between what I was trying to present as the offer and the reply, but that's okay because I still got the reply. I was like, sure, we do. You can see some of our offerings here. But notice what I'm doing here, and this is really important. I'm asking questions, right? I didn't send him my calendar link yet. I'm not pitching him on anything. So I also drop client names in here. You know, I get permission from our clients and I'll drop names here. This is stuff that's whited out, is redacted, but are there particular areas of focus you need help with? Would you like me to schedule some time with your link? And so he writes back, email marketing and remarketing. I'm like, oh God. It doesn't give me a lot of context, but I'm like, okay, let's get creative here. Yeah, I do. We do a ton of with both. Generally, the work falls in a couple categories, B2B sales on blah, 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 blah. I now have permission to put in front of this lead who has asked me for help. I now have permission to do a small pitch. And then he writes back, CC's like the head of marketing or whatever. Let's have a conversation about this so we can learn more. Please use my link below to schedule a Zoom. Okay. So it's almost always with these cold campaigns, like if I try to get them to go to sign up for something, total crickets. If I engage in a conversation, even if they don't become a customer, like what happens on a lot of these calls is they don't become a customer, but sometimes they do. Otherwise, we wouldn't do this channel. But we have an honest conversation about their business. And when we talk about B2B email and remarketing, this person doesn't even really understand remarketing. I'm saving some of the details about what I'm putting out there, but I know what they think about remarketing is using data that's like 2+ years old, right? With the privacy changes, and I've learned much of this stuff from Jen and the rest of our team, but remarketing like net cold doesn't work as well anymore. It's not like a primary strategy that you can use as a marketer. That ended with privacy changes, and it was already starting to trend away. So I had actually thrown in some nuggets here to educate him about how remarketing may be something that they use, but it's going to augment like a more effective paid acquisition strategy. And that was enough to get the conversation. I'm going to keep rolling. Any questions so far? Okay.
I have a question for
Sure
you.
thing.
Craig, maybe you'll get into this in a little bit, but I'm wondering what kinds of personalizations you typically put into your emails. I see you used his name. And I'm wondering if there are others that make sense or if it's a scalability issue.
It's a great question. Generally, the more personalization, the better. It doesn't necessarily have to be like one-to-one. Again, if you know that industry, you could drop in like industry stats. I'll show you one of my sequences where I talk about startup failure. And so if you're a startup, because I've been able to quantify failure, I can generally, that personalization of failure from the lens of that startup is actually something that they think about, right? Because they see all these stats. So it is a form of personalization to that industry and to that persona. The other things that you'll want to do will be, I'll use company name a lot. I'll use company name in the subject line. First name, last name, obviously are great. There's a lot of other things that you can do that are more interesting as you start to think about scale. So for example, you could slurp in data from Clearbit and some of the other data enrichment platforms. And it's a little bit outside of the scope of what I'll talk about today, but you could pull in very recent, very relevant content and merge it in. So if you know that this person was brand new on their job, you could say, "Hey, Len, congrats on your new job. Hope the transition from old company to new was good, right?" Borderline creepy, but you can actually pull that data and you can merge that in. And you can also build you could build logic in that's like, well, if this person doesn't have that merge field filled in, you just skip it. So part of it depends on how granular you want to get. Now, I've done a massive amount of cold email that I would consider to be kind of micro targeted campaigns. So the message itself is almost personalized because the focus is so narrow. So if the company size is between X and Y in a certain industry with a certain job title, there's things that I know about that target or that persona that are relevant to pretty much all of them. But that's going to be very different than what's going to be relevant to the list of 100 that I pull at a 1,000 person company, right? So you don't necessarily have to think about it as a one-to-one personalized message, but the closer you can get to that, even if it's by industry or company size, you could share something about the stage. You could say, "Hey, like for early stage startups like yours, we see 91% whatever it is," right? So you can use those different targeting criteria back here to actually personalize it to one level deeper without having to go through all the pain of like doing all the data enrichment and everything else that you may naturally want to do.
Got it. Thank you.
You're welcome. Okay, so I showed you this slide, lots of meetings booked. What I realized was that, first of all, the offer packaging messaging was off. I didn't know the industry, the company size was all over the map. It was a total disaster. But when we started to hone in on the messaging and targeting that worked, the next thing that I realized was that, okay, well, now I can get people on the phone, but they're just not qualified at all. And so I ended up in a scenario where people were using my cold outreach to get on a call with me to pick my brain about growth. Maybe they saw that like I charge a lot for it. I don't advertise rates often, but if they went, especially to my old website, like before this was Velocity Growth, they would see like, yeah, like it's kind of expensive if you want one-on-one or with anybody else on the team, but the value is high. So the perception of value is high. And I had done a lot of free mentorship on a couple different platforms. So people were kind of getting onto my calendar because I was accessible. And that's like one of our brand traits is we want to be accessible. But I had so many calendar invites that I was having like 8 to 10 meetings a day, frantic, not getting my other work done and not converting anybody. So, now messaging and stuff is working to drive interest, but interest is not qualified enough to drive a conversion. So that's the next thing that broke. And unfortunately, we scaled some of the stuff that was working on the messaging side before we realized that this was a problem. And I had a month and a half worth of meetings in the future that I couldn't go and cancel. So it was a summer, 2 summers ago. I spent much of that summer going into calls knowing that it wasn't a good fit, but I also I kind of didn't want to be a jerk and just cancel them all. Maybe I should have canceled them all, but at the time I didn't think that was the right thing to do. So I added this as the qualification. And in this is a version that I took a screenshot from like yesterday or something, but we've gone through many, many iterations now of the qualification step of our cold outreach process. And in what it is it's the same qualification step that anybody goes through from any channel if they want to get on a one-to-one sales call with us, because we really protect our time. And so notice what I'm doing here. I want to understand the company's elevator pitch. What stage are you at? And then context to help me prepare for the call. This is required. Who handles growth for your company? And what's the biggest challenge? Is it customer acquisition? Is it activation? Is it onboarding? Is it retention? Is it churn? This is required. How much are you going to spend over the next 3 to 6 months? Under 2,000 a month? What does that tell me? 51,000, 50,000 and above? What does that tell me? What offerings are you interested in? I literally have them tell me what they're interested in so that I can personalize, and I don't have to spend a lot of time on it. I can spend 30 seconds before a call, and all this data gets pushed into HubSpot. So when I'm in HubSpot and I'm on that contact in HubSpot and I click on it, in my notes, I already have all these notes. So I just copy those, put them into a new note in HubSpot. And I'll be like, hey, Dominique, you had expressed interest in paid acquisition. I see that you're spending, you plan to spend between 10 and 50,000 per month. Tell me about your prior 3 months spend and what have you learned? Okay. Well, I learned this and this and this and this. Well, it looks like you have a marketer that you're sharing this workload with. Well, what have been some of the pain points there? Well, it turns out that, and then you get them talking. And then I can go back to the stage. So if they're going to spend 10 to 50,000 and they've got a small team and they filled out that their seed stage, a lot of these companies are going to go for their Series A, right? And now there's pattern recognition. Now I know, based on what I know from the cold email and all the other channels that we're doing and having now dozens and dozens of conversations, that those stage companies need very specific things. And I can now come in and not just float through a sales call. I can actually give them real, valuable, actionable insights that whether or not they work with us or not, they can hopefully apply, which builds goodwill. It feels good to do it. And a lot of times a company of that stage will ask for a proposal. They can't always afford it. We may not have the bandwidth to do it. It could be bad timing, whatever it is, but we keep that relationship open. And this qualification is absolutely critical, because what a lot of you are going to do is go out there and you're going to drive the cold email channels and you're going to get on the call. And if you're doing customer discovery, that's great. But if you're doing it this any level of scale, you're going to waste a lot of time. Really hone in on this qualification. And I would urge you to do this across the board with all of your other channels too. If you're product led, great. Put in the constraints that you need to put in to ensure that you can do enough product personalization to drive stronger retention, because there's a direct correlation between onboarding, personalization, and retention within startups. Okay. So the qualification is key. Any questions there? Has anybody done this? Or has anybody done too much qualification and be like, oh God, I had to roll it back?
No, I haven't.
No, they're already coming to me qualified because they have to already be having surgery. So I'm
That's
fortunate enough to get to skip that part. So that, but I do know that if they're not qualified, obviously you don't need to be not wasting time with
don't
trying
spend
to
time.
get them that place. They're either there or they're not. So
Exactly. Fantastic. Okay, cool. So now we're going to get into some of the tools. I think at 1 o'clock, so in 12 minutes, we'll take like a 5-minute break and then we'll come back for 20, 25 minutes and then we'll hand it off to Jen. We should have some time. I'm not going to spend a ton of time on tools because the tools are actually fairly commoditized, but here are the tools that I think you need. Sales Navigator from LinkedIn is very, very helpful. It's not required, but it's very helpful. Apollo Search, and I'll show you the platform in a second. There's a couple other things. So this is a different view of what I showed you before. This is one of my targeting lists this is pulled from LinkedIn Sales Navigator, VPs of marketing at US large companies. So vice president of marketing, 1,001 to 5,000 headcount based in the United States. There's 8,500 of these out there. That's a lot of people to target. So you've got a really good kind of sandbox to play in here. You could, within a very low risk way, you could pull a list of 100 of these and do some micro experimentation to see how viable cold is for you. Again, hopefully you've been targeting them and have proven out your message in other channels first, but that's a sizable list that you can work with. Here's a totally different one. And this is using the Apollo interface. This is founders, US based, company size 11 to 50 with relevant industries that I thought were viable for this campaign that I was putting together. And you can see that there's 30,000 of them. So there's this weird, like, it's not a bell curve. It's like the inverse bell curve. There's like a gazillion founders early. And then there's like a gazillion like employees at later stage. And then there's this like dip in the middle, right? Where all those seed series A stage companies, they're not giant companies yet. So there's not gazillions of the same role that you can target within the company size and industry. So there's some levers that you need to think about here at the targeting level. But once you get into these tools, you can get a good sense of how big that audience is that you're going to go after. I mean, it would take me months to go after 30,000 records in a pre-scale version of cold outreach. And then you need great content, right? So we've talked a little bit about this, but your messaging has to be specific to that target audience. Then you need to start writing. And your goal is to write 4 or 5 emails in a cold email sequence of at least 3 add value. At least 3 add value. And I'll show you what I mean in a second. And again, use what you know works. And what you're going to do here is, because you're writing 4 or 5 emails, is you're going to put them into what's called a sequence. And what a sequence is, and you can do this through CRMs and you can do this through cold outreach programs. And if you're running marketing within a company right now with a CRM, you probably already have personalized sequences for your leads and for your customers and things like that. For cold outreach, it's very similar, but what you're doing is you're trying to get them to a point where they become a customer or kind of move up that ladder of engagement with you. So your sequence is the output of the 4 or 5 emails that you put together. And usually what you see is you'll write them and then you'll send an email, you'll send another 3 business days later, you'll send another 3 business days later, another 3 business days later, and maybe a 5th one 3 business days later. Maybe what you're also doing is you're sprinkling phone calls and LinkedIn outreach in between paths of the sequence. So email 1, email 2, SDR makes a call to that lead. Email 3, you reach out and connect with them on LinkedIn. Hi, I'm Craig. I share a lot of content about how to grow your startup. I'd love to be connected. Not a sales pitch. And then email 4, and then email 5, right? And if it's crickets at that point, you didn't hear from them and they didn't connect with you on LinkedIn, then you move to the next one, right? But you do this in an automated manner. Now, the best practices around cold email sequencing, they keep changing, right? Like privacy laws change. The way you do this for Europe is different than what you can do in the US. There's CAN spam laws. There's all sorts of stuff that you need to look out for. But that general playbook is some consistency over some amount of time. Now, I just talked to a founder at a company. Their product is, I want to say, $100 a month. So kind of mid-market SaaS. What's worked best for them is a 14 email cold outreach sequence, which just blew my mind because I've never written a 14 email sequence. But they had done a bunch of experiments and it turns out that it took 14 touch points. A lot of them were value add. Unfortunately, I don't have access to the campaign. Otherwise I would show it. But it just shows you that like sometimes that persistence is something that you need to bring to the table, especially if you're finding with your product, you do need many, 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 many touch points before a lead becomes a buyer or before a lead becomes a user. And only do what I call one bump. And so a bump is like, hey, did you get my last email? Or just checking to see if you got my last email. So here's an example of that same sequence that same target I was showing you before. This is going to founders, US based, 11 to 50 employees, fairly broad industry targeting. 5 emails, day 1 through day 13. This is a real example. Email 1, I ask a rhetorical question. So, hi, Dima, as a fellow founder, remember, these are founders, that's my targeting. As a fellow founder, it's personalized. Dima, personalized founder, are you happy with how Velocity Growth is growing right now? Rhetorical question. With the market dynamics changing, it's tough to know. It's tough to know what to do, right? It's really tough to know what to do with a company right now if you're feeling volatility from the market. Then it's normal and it's cyclical and it happens, but I was trying to dig in and lean into that. Then my single bump. So the second email was, hey, Antonio, wondering if you had any thoughts on my last message. Now, I feel like I'm being obnoxious when I send that out, but I still do it anyways because it works. But you do need to develop a little bit of a thick skin with this. Like sometimes people reply back and they'll be like, F off. Or, yeah, I do have thoughts on your last message and I hated it. Unsubscribe me or unsubscribe me. Totally normal. It happens. Just roll with it. You know, person might be having a bad day. Just give them the benefit of the doubt. Email 3, I drop knowledge. So this is where I start to nerd out on growth. So strong marketing compounds revenue. So, hi, Maria, I don't know what your current revenue is, but let's say it's 5,000 MRR right now. If you grow at 7% per month, which isn't bad, I say, where do you end at? Like I literally have this in a spreadsheet. And then I say, but if you grow at 20% a month, which is what most investors want to see, because again, 11 to 50 people at the company, founder, they're probably either they're bootstrapped or they're raising money. In either case, 20% month over month growth means that you have more than triple the revenue at the end of the year for the same investment of your time and money. Okay. So I drop knowledge. And then in the 4th email, I drop knowledge again. And this is when I talk about startup failure. We need more, and I show appreciation. We need more entrepreneurs like you doing the hard work, right? Like over 90% of startups fail. This is the paradox we face as founders. And I dig in deeper and deeper and deeper. And then the last one is like, I'm going to stop bugging you for a while after this email. But I did want to share my website, which has hundreds of free growth resources. Again, I'm not asking them to sign up. I'm not asking them to buy. At that point, I'm not asking them to book a meeting with me because they're probably not interested. In the emails above, I'm asking them to book a meeting. I call that the breakup email. Notice I don't say like, you'll never hear from me again. I get a lot of those and I'm like, you'll never hear from me again. And like a month later, I'm like, I recognize that name. Then I go back. I'm like, wait a minute. They told me that they were going to stop bugging me forever. And they didn't. Just do what you say you're going to do. Be consistent with it. And this is the one that I was telling you about, right? So I don't know what your current revenue is, but this is the whole thing. So if you grow at 7%, which isn't bad, you end up at 10K over 12 months. But if you figure out to hit 20%, you end up at 37,150. That's a 3x difference. How are you thinking about growth holistically? How will you get to that 20%? I ask all of these questions. Like I'm trying to get the founder thinking about how they're growing their startup. And if this is the type of growth that's what you're looking for, let's chat. I'll give you 30 minutes free to ask me anything. Now, remember, they hit this. So they get 30 minutes for free, but I get to learn something about their company too. And then I can have a real and fulfilling conversation with them. And actually, I love cold outreach because I meet new people. We have real conversations. Doesn't always lead to business, but we're building that goodwill again. And it takes a lot of time, but it's very rewarding when you have that conversation where you're talking about the value that your product brings and you're learning about their business. It's very, very fulfilling. And chances are you've got something like that tucked away somewhere in your business. So it's unlikely you're going to go from cold to scale or sale without multiple middle steps. We talked about that. Ideally, you don't have more than 2 calls to action. And I showed you, like, I used a click to book a meeting or kind of this rhetorical question to try to get them back talking to me. I think about reply, getting in your early emails, going for a reply is for warming up the leads that eventually maybe will want to book time, but you don't necessarily have to go like, click here to book time with me. Like, you can ask those rhetorical questions and build that dialogue with them. And then the tools and systems, many platforms are available. My current stack, what we're currently using is we have an extra email domain for sending email, velocity-growth.com instead of velocitygrowth.com. And in fact, HubSpot is set up to velocity-growth.com. So I use velocitygrowth.com for like general one-on-one emails. All my client emails are in there, but we send marketing emails from velocity-growth. So like any bulk email that we do, even if it's a fully opt-in, which is what our HubSpot list is, everybody gets it from that velocity-growth. So we minimize the risk on our main domain. And all of the cold outreach also comes from velocity-growth. But you can have, when we were scaling this originally, we had 6 or 7 different email addresses that we were using. It was all Craig at something, but we had just configured these platforms. What's great about cold outreach is that you can scale to thousands and thousands of messages a day if you need to, or if you want to. The technology is very, very easy to do. You just may need a couple different, they call them burner domains, and you need to warm those domains up using warm up inbox, and then you use Apollo. I'm going to break for just a couple minutes, because next what we're going to do is we're going to move into like some more granular details, and then we'll turn it over to Jen, and hopefully we'll have some time for Q&A. I will be back in like 1 minute or so if anybody has questions, but then at 1:05 Eastern, so 3 minutes from now, I'm going to start back again. So I'll see you in 3 minutes. Okay, yeah. So we talked a little bit about tools and systems. And I mentioned this a little bit before break, but you really want to get an extra email domain so that you don't impact the primary domain. I've had some really tough scenarios where, for whatever reason, a marketing email list gets marked with too many spam complaints, even though it was fully opt-in, or somebody tries to scale cold outreach too quickly from their main domain. I see this all the time, and they're wondering why their deliverability is down. In either case, I think there's a lot of value in having a separate domain for all this stuff so that you don't impact your primary domain. This also allows you to scale things up quickly once you start getting results. So with one email address in one domain, there are some limitations that you have from email sending providers in terms of how much you can scale it. So scaling is a combination of number of senders, so like people sending emails, and number of domains that you have. And so it's basically, you just run the math on that, and then it's how much frequency can you send? So how many emails can you send in a day for each of those? And that's kind of like what you use to determine how effectively you can scale this up. The other thing I love about using a secondary domain for things like this is that you can think about more delegation. So again, if you can scale cold outreach, and you've got a secondary domain for this, you can also use that domain for other things like sending regular marketing emails like we talked about. But it also means that you could have multiple different SDRs working in low risk environments on different subdomains, or I'm sorry, on different primary domains, that if something goes awry with one of the SDRs, let's say that they didn't follow your best practices, it doesn't risk everything else that everybody else is working on, right? So again, I'm talking a kind of massive scale is when you want to think about this. Early days, it's a lot of blocking and tackling. So I put a QR code here for Warm Up Inbox. We're a referral partner of them. I think I think they give us like a 5% revenue share deal or something, but I think you get a savings if you use our QR code, or just go Google warm up inbox. But this has been a pretty good tool that I've used on a bunch of different projects for doing email warming up. And what this is basically, as a precursor to scaling, what warm up inbox and some of these other platforms do is they'll actually use your email address on your new domain to send real emails out. It's fake content, but they're kind of real sounding, to a list of humans and non-humans that they have. They've got like machines doing some of this work to like and engage and reply to this email. So it quote unquote warms it up, especially if you're on Gmail. If your organization's on Gmail, Google looks for signals like, did somebody star this message? Did somebody mark it as spam? Did they archive it immediately? Did they delete it immediately? Did it stay in their inbox for a little while? Did they mark it as important? Did they reply to it? Did they forward it? All those things Gmail can actually track behind the scenes. And what they're doing is they're getting data on how healthy the email side of the organization is. So check out Warm Up Inbox. It looks like this, where you've got your main domain or your secondary domains tied to an email address, and it gives you a domain reputation. And this was taken quite a while ago. So let me see if I have, I got Warm Up Inbox here. So velocity dash growth, what was it before? 78. It was at 76. And now a couple weeks later, I'm at 78. And you can see that this Warm Up Inbox has sent 1,100 messages and only 2 have been marked as spam. And then what you can do is you can get a sense of your email reputation over time, which is basically just shows you the health of your email domain over some period of time. And so I was working with a consumer startup that had a really big email list, and something happened and their domain just got put on all the blacklists. And at the time, we didn't have a lot of these tools to use like Warm Up Inbox, and we had to do this very manually. And it took 6+ months to get back to a point where they could really have viability with their domain. And now the tools have made it really easy. And you can see with velocity growth, my reputation's an 88, and you could see that trend over time. I think I started at 85 or 86, and now we're at 88. Right? I guess that hasn't really changed too much in the last month, but it's still doing the diligence of going through and ensuring that like I'm not on a domain blacklist. So you could see that my domain age is new because velocity growth is actually a fairly new domain. And days of warming is how long have we been warming up this inbox. So the longer you go, the better your reputation will get from this platform. So I would strongly encourage you to sign up for one of these. They're really cheap. They're like $29 a month for the basic plan. I think $50 a month for the more expensive plan. And it just will save you headaches down the road. Moving forward, I also have a bit.ly here and a QR code for Apollo. And I think this one gives you 20% off if you use our code. Apollo is what we use to actually send the emails out. And what I love about Apollo, so I've used a lot of different cold outreach platforms, and we're generally platform agnostic at Velocity Growth. Like, we're not trying to sell you on any particular platform. I use all of them and I like a lot of them. Apollo is what I've found to be the most helpful for me and my personal workflow. Again, may or may not be the best for you, but I would urge you to look at it. It forces me to be highly organized, and it's going to enable you to think about, again, just like that delegation component. Like, you can have multiple people log into Apollo, and you can have multiple people creating multiple campaigns within Apollo. This is the list view. So within Apollo lists, you can see here, okay, I have a bunch of experiments. You can see like we ran a London meetup. And so I was doing some outreach to them really early, actually, with the new domain. This was a warmer list of attendee signups and people that didn't attend. So I'm kind of using it for dual purpose. But these experiments, this R experiment 1, 2, and 3 are fairly sizable lists that I put together in Apollo. And again, I'll show you Apollo in a little bit more detail in a second. But what I'm doing is I'm setting some pretty specific limits on how much Apollo is going to send on a daily basis. And this has gone up over time as I've used warm up inbox to enable me to send more emails. But at the start, I would only send a maximum of 50 emails in any 24-hour period. Because if you try to throttle up cold email from 0 to hundreds a day, you're gonna get put on like, you're gonna hit all the tripwires with Gmail and other inbox platforms that are gonna say, wait a minute, I don't really know who this Craig at Velocity Dash Growth is, and now they're sending like 200 emails a day. I'm gonna kind of keep a suspicious watch over them. And so these are some of the settings and things that you can do. Again, you can do this in other tools outside of Apollo, but Apollo makes it really, really nice, and they give you a lot of contextual help as well. And then here is an example of what the interface looks like at the sequence level. So you can see here, this was a totally different campaign. I think social proof might have been the title. I don't remember what this one was, but you can see the interface here where total number of messages to be sent, number of scheduled, number that were delivered, number not open, unsubscribed, replied, and interested. I don't really use this interested. Apollo has built in interest tracking that they use like their machine learning to figure out and to help you figure out if somebody's interested. I know they're interested if they reply back to me or if they click on something and if they end up in our HubSpot. That's kind of how I look at it. And so I just want to spend a minute or two showing you the platform. And so you've got these really great analytics dashboards that let you see basically like the performance of all of your different campaigns. Using this test 2, I think this is the one that I showed. I at least showed, yeah, this is one of the ones that I showed. You could see that, I mean, these are all very early experiments, by the way. So the stuff that I'm showing in this presentation is from a very specific set of experiments with very specific targeting. But I want to show you kind of how it works. You can create your email message here, and you do it in this little box, right? And here I'm just using like, in this case, Jason Calacanis as like the lead where I was on This Week in Startups. So I'm trying to use that social proof because again, nobody knows who I am, right? But they may know who he is. And so I'm leading with that because I did this really fun episode on This Week in Startups on how to grow your startup. I've actually been on the show a couple of times. So like toot your own horn, right? Build that social proof. That's email 1. Email 2 is my kind of obnoxious, like, hey, did you see my last message? Email 3 is where it starts to get more interesting, where I'm really trying to add that value. Talk about the MRR, I talk about the ARR, I talk about these pillars of growth. And again, this is done. So this is day 1, this is day 4, this is day 7, this is day 10. Subject line is failure, ... 90% of startups fail. Had hundreds of conversations. These are the main like challenges that startups have. This is pulled from all those conversations I had, right? You can learn more about my work and book time with me here. Again, that goes to qualification. And then I also say here, like, we also have a lot of these free resources. So feel free to click on those. And you get a lot of really interesting stats too. So like I could go in and I don't think I have the stats on this one, but what I can do is I can go into my analytics side here in my reporting, and you can see, okay, well, I had X open, Y replied, what's my conversion ratio there? What was my sequence funnel? I can figure out, okay, well, in this case, again, it was very, very kind of targeted to founders and CEOs. And then small employees, but check this out, industries that were relevant, even some of the keywords that were related to these company startups are in there. And so everything is just kind of like really tightly coupled for you in Apollo. And the last thing I want to show you in here is just how some of the searches work. So I can pull together, I don't know, let me check this out. This one is, yeah, just one that I was playing around with. So industry is leisure, travel, and tourism. there's 910,000 people in that audience. So there's no way, like, that's just not targeted at all. Okay, well, what if I said that I want to target founders? And by the way, you can also build personas right into Apollo and some of these other tools. I did something wrong when building this persona. I haven't actually explored this feature all that much. I usually just do it from scratch. But like, I want to find CEO and I want to find founder. Now there's 20,000. So we went from 900,000 to now 19,000 CEOs and founders in the leisure, travel, and tourism space. And then if I want to look at company, I can look at specifics. So like if I want to do account-based targeting, I could look at like Airbnb. I could plug Airbnb in there. Probably not going to do that. And I know that my targeting is best for companies between 21 and 50 and 51 to 100. And then I'm like, okay, well, I got 2.4K. That's too big of a list for me, but I think this list of 1,700 is interesting. And I think I can do something with this list. So what I will generally do is I'll select the first 100 of these contacts and put them into a list called, like, I would call this one something like tourism dash 21 to 50 dash founder list 1. And since there's 1,700s, I could create 17 of those lists of 100. So when I go back to here, let me show you some of my lists. Okay. So you can see all of these lists here and the size of these lists, right? What I then do is I leverage those lists for my sequences. So when I look at one of these sequences, so I'll go into this one right here. Okay, well, who are the contacts? Well, I pulled these contacts from a very specific list that I put together as an experiment because I'm not at scale stage yet. So I do 100 at a time and I just batch them up. And so there's a lot you can do here, right? So these 4 interested, and again, I use a different methodology. I don't use a lot of the built-in stuff here. And when these get into HubSpot, I kind of do my further tracking and look at them there. So that's kind of the world of Apollo. And again, there's a lot of different settings and configurations that you can do. Like, I don't email anybody, at least on this campaign, I didn't email anybody on the weekend, but on other campaigns, I'm actually testing sending people messages on Saturday and Sunday, which you could argue is obnoxious, but like, I want to understand, like, I've had a hypothesis that founders work a lot of weekends. And that's true, because if you look at some of my other test campaigns, like, they reply on Saturday or Sunday, whereas on a Monday, they might not, or on a Friday, they may not. Right. So again, you want to build those lists and those audiences and those messages very specifically against those patterns that you start to recognize from your audience. So we went through this. And then just lastly, like, treat this whole thing as a giant experiment. You want to test those lists as small chunks. Like I just showed you, I break them down to 100. 100 is a nice round number. It makes it really easy for me to kind of keep track of things. It's more work to build a list of 100, but I just do it all at once. I take that list of 1,700, I break it into 17 lists or 4 lists if I don't know yet if that persona works. And then maybe I'll go larger company size. So I just change the list name and I run messaging tests against that, test those subject lines, test the message, test the targeting, test the cadence, test the frequency, and then you'll start to get a sense of, okay, well, what is actually resonating with this audience and what's viable, what's not viable. When you think about scaling, really, you're going to think about scaling when you have both the intuition that tells you should scale, like you're going to kind of feel it based on whatever core metric you're tracking. And then the data is going to tell you as well. what I would recommend is that you incrementally scale all this up. If you start to get stuff that's working, your propensity is just going to be to like 10x it. Cold email is a little tricky, right? You can't go from 1 to 100, but you can go from 1 to 2 to 5 to 10 to 20 to 30, right? You can more incrementally scale it up. Make sure you're doing that warm up inbox. And then you can start to build a lot more depth with these cold outreach campaigns. And this will take you months to do. This is not going to be an overnight thing. At scale, you add those multiple mailboxes, which is what we talked about. And then you can increase the velocity again. So if you've got one email address sending 100 emails a day, you can send 500 a week. If you've got 2 emails sending 100 a day, you double that. If you've got 2 domains with 2 emails each, now you're at 4x, so on and so on and so on. And then you can gradually increase those limits. And then be ready to course correct, right? Like, you're going to have constant iterations on this. Think about that messaging again. Think about going back to targeting and just run it as a big experiment. That's probably the best advice I can give you on it. So that's the end of my content. Okay, well, listen, I will, I'm going to hand it over to Jen here, and appreciate everybody's nuggets that you've brought to the table. And I'll be hanging out at 3 if you want to go deeper into any of this stuff as well. But thank you so much. And Jen, it's all yours.